Well, hello there everyone, and welcome to another UXW Bill video. As you may be able to see, the kitchen stove has been pulled out from the wall. This is a 1971 or possibly 1972 Hotpoint model. It's actually something of an heirloom. That's right, this stove has been in the family since my mother's sister, or my aunt, bought it brand new. It was my great-grandmother on my mother's side that used it for several years to can and preserve various fruits and vegetables. And at the time of her passing in the mid-1980s, as her home was being emptied and cleaned out, my mother took it upon herself to move this stove down here to central Illinois, where it still resides today. So naturally, there is a bit of sentimental attachment to something like this, even as silly as that might sound. And unfortunately, as you may have guessed by the fact that it's pulled out from the wall right now, there has been a little bit of a breakdown. And my mother was actually very sad because she thought that it might mean the end of being able to use her beloved Hotpoint stove. And I certainly like this stove. The thing that I like about it the most is the fact that it's larger than the average stove. I don't believe they make stoves like this anymore, at least not until you get up into stratospheric style pricing for them. But there's this little work area over here off to the side, so as you're preparing food and whatnot, you actually don't have to stray very far from the stove. Now, over the years, this thing has had a few minor problems and breakdowns, but really, at 54 years of age, who can blame it? Some of those breakdowns include this simmer stat, or the heat control for the right front burner. We also lost the light switch for the fluorescent work light that you may actually be able to see up in there. Yeah, just barely. It kind of crumbled to dust. I think we'll be repairing that in the near future. Over the years, we've also replaced, I think, one or two of these surface burners, maybe just the one, because these are the originals, and they still have a GE Calrod logo in them. It's faded due to years of heat and oxidation, but you may still be able to see it. This one, however, has been replaced not once, but twice. So maybe just this one surface unit, one light switch, that because it also served as a starting switch, I never was able to find a replacement for it. One simmer stat, a whole slew of oven light bulbs. This oven light bulb still works just fine though, but we don't use the little oven very often. I don't know what it is about modern day oven light bulbs. The one that was in here from day one lasted for decades, probably 30 or more years. When you consider the kind of heat that that's exposed to as it operates, it's really pretty incredible. But none of the replacements that I have purchased from a multitude of brands have ever lasted even a year. But I bought a replacement oven light, so we'll be putting one of those in as well. We've also replaced the primary oven heating element a couple of times over this thing's lifetime. But the trouble here today is actually with this control. This is the mode switch for the larger of the two ovens. You can see that we have a couple of modes of operation to choose from here: off, bake, timed bake, and broil. Speaking of timed bake, for those who are wondering, now I've seen a lot of these that are broken down. You probably have too, and I think they have something of a reputation, these mechanical stove timers, for failing over the years. But I want to show you something. This thing has not slipped a bit. It is still keeping perfect time, and every function still works, including not only the countdown timer, but also the timed bake mode of operation. So what's going wrong here? About a week or two ago, my father went to make himself a pot pie in the oven, and he turned it on, came back 20 minutes later when the pot pie was supposed to be done. There was absolutely no heat. He left it for a little while longer. It still didn't heat, and eventually he realized that something had probably failed. And so I started to look into it. He called around to a few different appliance parts houses. Most of them told him that the part was no longer available. One actually laughed at him, and that's when I got involved. I started looking around, and of course over the years, the part number for that particular mode switch has changed several times. So it's quite a chore to track it down. I did actually manage to find a replacement control. It's a kit. This is the part number for it, in case you happen to need one, because this actually does work for several different General Electric and Hotpoint applications. GE and Hotpoint here in the United States are one and the same thing. That is not, however, true overseas. And yes, this part is long discontinued. This one dates from 2013, and back then, although we really have to look carefully to see it, someone would have paid $90 for this replacement part kit, which includes the control that works across a wide variety of different applications, as indicated by the long stem on the control. You cut this down to size, and elsewhere in the packaging, there's actually a series of plastic adapter inserts that you use to adapt the stem of the control to the knob that your particular stove has. There's a couple of replacement wires in here. And the most hilarious thing of all, and I never would have believed that this was original to the package had it not been sealed, but these are the instructions. And they really don't tell you much of anything. If you want to read them, you can pause the video. All they really talk about is how to cut down the stem on the control and select the right adapter to meet your needs. You can definitely tell this is an older document. Looks like it was photocopied. Here's the part that I just couldn't believe. It's actually got handwriting on it. Like, this is the best available documentation that General Electric had, and somebody just happened to copy it, handwriting and all, and throw it in the package. Now, I did try to bring this control back to life by shooting it full of contact cleaner. That did get the oven heating again. Unfortunately, a couple minutes later, I happened to notice that the control was smoking considerably. And smoking for electrical controls is as bad as smoking for people. How's that for an obnoxious opinion? I'm sure I'll get some flack in the comments about that. This control had actually been kind of janky for a while. One of the things that it would sometimes do after you had finished baking and turned it to the off position, after a while as the oven cooled down, you might hear the thermostat click, and when you did, because the circuit was being completed as the thermostat was no longer satisfied, there'd be no heat in the oven, but the right oven status indicator light would turn on. It's been doing that for many years, almost as far back as I can remember, and the way that you would fix it would be to simply turn this control over to broil and then to off, which would break the circuit. So it's been going downhill for a long time. Another problem that happened to surface while my mother was cleaning the stove and mopping around with a sponge, she noticed that after I'd cleaned this control, this light was flashing on and off as she bumped and jarred the stove. Now, I probably can't get it to do that now. Oh, yes, I can. So that control is just completely diddled, needs to be replaced, which is exactly what we're going to do in this video. However, this is not a how-to video, and I want to point out that you and you alone are responsible for the results of your actions. Sheet metal's sharp, stoves get hot, electricity has the potential to be very dangerous. Make sure that you disconnect power before you ever work on anything like this. And if you're not sure what you're doing, by all means, please stop and get a qualified repair person, because the life, property, or well-being you save could be your own or that of your loved ones, and I am in no way responsible for the results of what you decide to do based on watching this video. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm getting ready to make this thing happen. Now, one of the things that came up was whether or not this would really be the correct replacement control for this application. Now, at first, I did not realize that there was a schematic hidden away somewhere in the stove and that after 54 years it would actually still be there. I did later find it, but before I did, I went through the existing control with a multimeter and determined what sets of contacts make and break as the mode switch is rotated. Now, on this new control, I've labeled the positions with what they do. We have off at the top, bake to the right, timed bake at the bottom, and broil to the left. And then up here we have the date, so that 50 years from now, when someone finds this, if this stove still exists, they'll know that some random person made a video. Well, they won't know that I made a video on YouTube, but they'll know that I replaced this control at some point. So I know that this control is compatible because I've tested all of the contacts to make sure they're doing the right things. If it hadn't been compatible as wired, I probably could have adjusted things to make it work, and I was actually going into this fully expecting I might have to do that. And there's no turning back here because I went ahead and I shortened that stem. I also picked out the right adapter from the package and inserted it into the oven control knob. And I just made sure that I was inserting that adapter the right way so that the dot on the control reflects the actual position of the control and matches the legend printed on the stove's console. There's the little piece that was left over. Now, one of the wires with the existing control, as it goes over to the thermostat to provide power there, that wire didn't look so great. Maybe it contributed to the demise of the old switch, I don't know. Most of the other wires inside the stove are in excellent condition, so I'm going to reuse them. But I will replace that one. However, for some reason, General Electric only populated one end of this. I can't imagine that any of the applications for which this control fits would actually have like a screw-on terminal or anything like that, or something similar. So I don't know why they did that. But we'll go ahead and we'll pop off the pre-stripped end here. And then I've got a little connector right here that I'll go ahead and crimp into place. I really need more hands than I've got to do this well, so let's see how badly wrong this happens to go. Well, not too bad. Now, it is certainly possible that I'll need to shorten this shaft a little more than I already have. But of course, I don't want to go too far because there is no way to put it back. Here's the old control in all of its glory. I've gone ahead and removed it from the console of the stove, but all the wiring is still hooked up. And as you can see here, we have not only the part numbers, but also the various wires. Line 1, neutral. Yes, there's a reason they brought neutral to it. Time bake 1, line 2, and then A, B, and C, which connect to the various oven elements in differing ways depending upon how this switch is set. Now, the wires for A and B, they look pretty good, but wire C isn't looking so hot. Now, terminal C and line 2, they are connected together in every mode of this switch's operation, and I believe that was the point of failure after making some meter tests here. So we're going to replace wire C because not only does this look absolutely terrible, but we also have a little bit of a bubble in the wire there. And then over here at the actual oven thermostat, which I would imagine is probably similarly unavailable at this point. Don't know if any new old stock examples of those happen to exist, and I hope we don't have to find out for a long time. But all these terminals still seem to be in excellent condition. So we'll just leave them alone and replace only this wire that appears to have gone bad. Now, another failure point in this stove is that of the indicator lights that tell you what it's doing. Now, the little light bulbs themselves, they're little neon lamps, they all happen to still work perfectly well. But it's the plastic that time has gotten even with. I suppose that exposure to heat and chemical instability of the plastic conspired to make these little plastic enclosures come apart. But as you can see, I went ahead and patched these back together. So now we have a working surface units, that is to say the burners on the stovetop indicator. We also have the right oven indicator patched back together. The one for the left oven is still good, but I suspect that its time is probably coming eventually as well. It may not have been the most brilliant move ever to simply tape these up with electrical tape, especially considering the temperature range that they're exposed to, but it was the fix that I had available at the time. Some kind of glue, especially something that's suitable for high temperatures, might have been a better idea. This is the simmerstat that was replaced, and these are still very readily available because modern electric stoves, by and large, as long as they still have burner coils of the same type seen on this stove, these still work identically, and so they're readily available. Let's go ahead and swap this control out. Now, ordinarily, I would be happy to record video footage of what I'm doing here, but as it happens, I don't have enough hands to actually do that. Can't hold the iPhone and work on the control wiring at the same time. And of course, no one has ever invented anything to solve that particular problem, at least not that I know of. So you'll just have to wait a moment and we'll be back in an instant thanks to the magic of video editing. I went ahead and I shortened this control to the maximum extent possible, and it looks like it's still going to be too long with the adapter in place, and as though this control is going to stand quite proud of all the others. There aren't any other adapters in the package that really fit this control, at least not in my experimentation, but I might go ahead and revisit that, or maybe see if I can shorten this a little bit, though again I want to be very careful in doing so because I can't put back what I take off. Okay, I went ahead and I shortened this adapter as much as I dare to do. I tried some of the other adapters in the package and none of them fit this control as well as this one does. So it's still going to stand a little bit proud of all the other controls, but I guess we'll just have to live with that. I certainly don't have that level of OCD. But now we'll plug in the stove and see if it works. Here's the new control all hooked up in place of the old one. And at the bottom there is my replacement wire that runs over here to the oven thermostat. Now, for those of you in the viewing audience who happen to be curious, I've gone outside so we can make use of the brilliant sunlight and really get a good look at this old control, as well as this wire and some of the adventures that it's seen over the years. Also get a picture of the writing that's on the back of the control if we can. Looks like I'll have to get this wire out of the way. I could not divine any useful information from any of the numbers that are written on this control. Now, as I happen to be feeling fairly confident, I could just put power to this thing and see what happens. But that's not a really great idea, because if there is a problem in the wiring and it involves a short circuit, those fuses down in the basement, they might hold on for a lot longer than I want. And it's not exactly easy to get down there and unplug that cord very quickly if the need arose. So I have a meter hooked up over here in resistance measurement mode. We'll turn this to bake. And we'll wait for the auto ranging to take place. 24 ohms, it seems fairly reasonable. Time to bake. Again, wait for the auto ranging to take place. Should be very high resistance. And then broil. Same kind of thing, wait for the auto ranging to take place. And we read 18 ohms. So I think we're probably good to go ahead and put power to this thing. Now, if I happen to really care that much, I just thought of something I could do to adjust the depth of this control so that's more in line with the others. I could simply stack up some washers on the mounting screws until the control is recessed enough that the knob matches with all the others. Now, onto the oven lights. I've bought all the name brands that you can imagine over the years when I've put light bulbs in this thing in the past. None of them have lasted. So now we're going to try the anonymous Chinese option from Amazon. Let's just see what they sent us here. Pop this box open. Seems like they did a nice job of packaging this little bulb. Let's see if we can get it out of the box one-handed. Actually looks pretty reasonably well made. There's the new bulb, there's the old bulb, and the old bulb definitely looks a little baked. And we can certainly see where the filament failed. All right, we're plugged in and powered up. The oven light bulb has been changed. Yes, the oven needs to be cleaned. We'll work on that in the near future. Here we go, folks. 1, 2, 3. Please don't blow up. Our oven pilot light is on. We'll turn our thermostat up a little bit. And then we'll get our thermal camera And we'll just see what's going on everywhere. Wait for it to finish booting up here. Open the lens cap, that would be a good idea. Nothing but professionalism around here. All right, let's see if our elements are getting hot. I don't know why the thermal camera is having trouble with that. The element is definitely hot. I can feel it. Might be because the temperature range isn't set correctly. So let me check that real quick. Last time I used this thing, I was measuring something that was very cold. And sure enough, it's on the wrong setting. So let's try it now. Yep, it's still having a little trouble with it, interestingly enough. Now our top element should be running at about half power. And indeed, it is. So on bake, we're operating correctly. Now, when we turn it to time bake, the power draw should go to 0 because the timer is not engaged for baking right now. And when we turn it to broil, the top element only should be on, and it is. And then when we turn it off, all the current draw should stop. So now we're going to turn it back on again, and I'm going to adjust the settings on the camera again, and we're going to inspect the control at the back of the unit and make sure that it's not in any kind of duress. There does seem to be a little bit of heat in there, but nothing that I would consider tremendously abnormal. So we might as well go ahead and put the old stove back together. So here's the back panel of the stove in place. Everything's been put completely back together. One thing that I happen to be curious about is the purpose of this little metal door on the back side of this cover. At first I thought that this might be available so that you could open the door and perhaps calibrate the oven thermostat, but that's actually done from the front after you remove the temperature knob. Then I got to thinking, well, maybe it's so that a service technician or someone who had a reason to do so could stick an ammeter on some of the wiring back here and measure the current drawn by the oven elements, make sure they were all working. But if that was true, there ought to be another one of those doors over here on the other side so that you could do the same thing for the small oven. If there's anybody out there in the viewing audience that knows what that's for, I would certainly be greatly interested in hearing about it. We'll look a little further down here, and you can actually see that the instructions that show you how to wire this up for use as a display piece in a store are still in place. And if you want to read any of that, you can pause the video. We also have a notice down here about the stove's wiring. Again, if you want to read it, you can pause the video. And then moving over here, we have installation instructions for the Hotpoint range. Now for most of you, here's where the video probably ends. But if there are any of you who are interested in seeing the original schematic and the manual for this stove, that'll be in the next portion of the video coming right up. All right, for those of you in the viewing audience who happen to be curious and are still watching, I went ahead and I popped loose the tabs that held this old control together. I don't know what will happen when I take this top cover completely off, if there's going to be a rather loud spring and then control pieces all over the room. Something already managed to escape here. Looks like a little piece of spring steel or something. So let's just see how cooked this poor old control happens to be. There's a GE logo on it, made in USA. The replacement certainly wasn't. Underwriter lab listed. So here's another piece of metal. Two pieces of metal, actually. You can ignore the oily residue, that's the contact cleaner. And here's the knob and the shaft. And then these are the internal workings of the control itself, their contact surfaces. Now, I may have to take this apart a little bit further before we can see anything else, but I think we're to the start of the point where we can definitely see enough. Just look down here at the bottom. You see this arm? This is an electrical contact, and if I had to guess, it looks like that's the one that went between L2 and terminal C, which just from the appearance of this control, the discoloration of the printing, the condition of this wire, you could tell before I even took this apart that thing had been hot over time. But no one could accuse this control of quitting early. 54 years of heaven only knows how many actuations, maybe some of them a little less than gentle, especially in a home that had children in it. But I'll take this a little further apart and we'll look at the condition of some of these contact surfaces. As if this poor old switch hadn't had a bad enough day already, I haven't gone and made it any better by bending these contact arms out of the way. And the first and most severely degraded one, as I suspected it would be, is the contact point that goes between the C terminal and the L2 connection for the incoming AC power. Not only can you tell that's been very, very hot over time, but these contact surfaces are very badly pitted and degraded. Now, when these sorts of switches are first manufactured, these contact points are actually silver plated. The reason being that the silver resists the degradation caused by the arc that occurs every time this switch makes or breaks. Now, that arc varies in intensity depending upon just where the AC waveform happens to be. For example, if this was switched on near the zero crossing point, i.e. 0 volts, the arc would be very, very small and minimally destructive. But if, on the other hand, you're up at the peak of the waveform, around 170 volts peak, the arc could be much more destructive and intense. And even the silver eventually gives in to that sort of harsh treatment. When the silver gives in, the less noble metals that the contact points have underneath are exposed, and while they will generally still function, they do not conduct as well. They are degraded much more quickly by the arcing, and then begins a vicious cycle with the contacts pitting and heating, thus accelerating their degradation. And that is the mechanism of failure in these switches. You'll see this in other kinds of switches as well. Basically, anything that makes or breaks an electrical contact will eventually give in to this, no matter what it happens to be. In fact, if you remember back years ago, I made a video about replacing the timer in a Kenmore automatic washing machine where this same kind of failure had occurred and resulted in the machine being unable to complete its cycle. These other terminals are not quite as badly degraded, but they're not in great condition either. You can see there's signs of arcing damage there. And then if we tilt this arm up, there's yet another contact point here. I'm sure you can see the difference between this and that. This is still fairly serviceable. It's not great. This is ruined. And that's almost certainly why the poor switch started smoking. And of course, there was no chance that contact cleaner could really do anything for this. All of these contact points should be shiny, and in the new switch they will be. But you can definitely see how the degradation has taken place up close and personal there. Now here, for those of you who happen to be curious, is the original owner's manual for this Hotpoint stove. This book actually covers several different stoves. There were 3 different models in this general range, each with varying degrees of features. You'll see more about that here in just a moment. If you want to read any of these pages, the video should be more than high enough resolution to make that possible. So just go ahead and pause the video. I am also going to scan these materials for preservation at some point and make them available for download. Look for a link to appear in the description of this video at some point in the future. You can definitely tell that times have changed in all the years that have passed since this was written. And while I can read and even to some extent still write in cursive, I could not tell you what this woman's last name is. I'm thinking maybe Gravers. I can tell that her first name's Virginia. I would be a little surprised if she's still with us today. If any of you happen to work for General Electric at the time this stove was made and you're watching this video, I would love to hear from you. So here's the table of contents. This is a discussion of the three models that exist. The RC547. This is the one we have, the RC556. And then there is also an RC558. Now it appears to me that the 547 and the 558 models do not have the second oven. They never really tell you in the manual, but I guess that this is just a storage compartment on those models. But over here, it's actually a second oven that you can use. The 558 actually trades the second oven for a burner that has adjustable diameters, so you can turn off and on various coils depending upon how large the cooking vessel that you're going to use happens to be. My understanding is that those burners were long ago discontinued and that no replacement exists today. I do remember reading somewhere that a lot of people were looking for them, and I would guess any new old stock examples have long ago vanished at this point. And then, of course, over here on the other page, we have a feature chart explaining what you got with each stove. So we'll go ahead and turn the page again. This tells you all about surface cooking, how the simmer stats work. They refer to them as infinite heat controls. Again, if you want to read this, just go ahead and pause the video. We'll turn the page again. And here, of course, are some other materials. We'll look at those more in just a moment. For now, I'll set them aside. And you can read all about using the oven. Roasting and broiling. How to take care of your Hotpoint range. And then finally here on the back page, we have the Hotpoint limited warranty. Apparently they gave you just a year's worth of coverage. Now General Electric, of course, has long been out of the appliance business. They sold it off to Haier, i.e. the Chinese. But to Haier's credit, the appliance park in Louisville, Kentucky is still very much in operation, and I believe it's even been substantially expanded since they acquired the General Electric appliance brand. Here, of course, at the bottom is information about the publication number as well as the part number for this manual. And just in case you happen to miss it and want to read it, there's the limited warranty that Hotpoint offered on this range when it was brand new. I guess we never needed it. This is some discussion about the oven control, some of the work that my parents did to try and figure out where a replacement control could be had. And then this is a little diagram that I drew that explains in more detail how the oven mode switch works. This is with the switch in the bake position. Here in the United States, power is delivered to most homes using what's called a split phase system. That is to say, at the pole transformer, you have 120 volt leg, another 120 volt leg, and then you have a neutral that is bonded to ground at the center tap output of the transformer. When you combine these two, because they are out of phase with one another, you will get 240 volts. So yes, here in the United States, we do actually have 240 volt electricity available to us, but we typically only use it for large capacity, large energy consumption loads, such as central air conditioning, stoves, electric dryers, electric water heaters, heat pumps, resistive heating furnaces, and similar sorts of things. Most of our appliances just run from one leg of 120 volts with a connection to the neutral to allow for the flow of electrical current. And about half of the circuits in a home are attached to one leg or the other, hopefully in a way that evenly balances things out. Here we have terminal L1 on the switch. I guess I'll get the carcass over here so we can look at this and you can see how this worked. We have the first leg of power coming in here. When the oven switch is in the bake mode, this makes with terminal A, that then in turn takes one leg of power to the oven thermostat. We also have a connection to the neutral, and as you'll see in a moment, some of you may have already figured this out. There is a reason for that when the switch is in bake mode. And then in all modes of operation, we have the L2 and C connection. This makes in every mode that this switch can be placed in. This contact is always in use whenever this switch is turned on. So what they do here is they send full 240 volts to the main oven heating element. The broil element in the top of the oven is connected when in bake mode to neutral on one side and 120 volts on the other, meaning that this runs at about half power because it's running from half the voltage. Now, somewhat curiously, and I don't know why this was done, but somewhat curiously, the broil element is not run at half power when timed bake mode is enabled. You only get the main element in that case. So here, if you want to pause the video and look at it, is the diagram that I drew that explains how things are connected when the switch is in its baking mode of operation, as well as the actual remains of the switch itself. If you want to study that, you can pause the video. Then next up, we have oven shelf positions in your new range. If you want to read that, go ahead and pause the video for a moment. We have the installation guide. It tells you what you need to know in order to safely and successfully install your Hotpoint electric range. Again, if you want to read that, go ahead and pause the video. And then finally, we have the schematic that was actually stored inside the stove. And here's a closer look at the schematic that goes with the RC556 electric range. If you'd like to study this in more detail, again, feel free to pause the video. It should be of sufficient resolution that you can clearly make everything out. And as with the owner's manual, I do intend to scan this at some point. This used to live inside a little envelope that was attached to the rear of the range console. We decided to move it out of there and put it with the rest of the documentation so that there would be no more degradation in the face of heat and grease and other things that the electric range is exposed to as it operates. Now, the part that we want to look at much more closely is right down here, and that is the oven circuit switch diagram. I apologize for the shadow that's being cast by the phone. I did not realize at first that there was still a schematic inside the stove, so at first I went ahead and actually drew out what's called a truth table to figure out which contacts of this switch made and in which positions. A truth table being something that describes every state that an electrical switch can be in. I was overjoyed to find this because it confirmed that my suspicions about what contacts do what were in fact correct, and it helped me to find a replacement switch as well. We can see right here that each contact and when it makes or breaks is outlined here in the middle. For example, switch point A makes with TB or time bake in one position, makes with bake in another position. Terminal B makes for broil or bake depending upon where the control is set, and terminal C, of course, makes in all modes of operation.
So as you can see, it's actually impossible for the broiling element to be energized when you're in time bake mode, and indeed, it is not used. I don't know why they decided to make that design change. Maybe it simply complicated the design of the switching logic too much. But there's a look at the schematic if anyone happens to be curious, and again, you can simply pause the video if you'd like to see it. I would like to thank you for watching this video, especially if you made it through the entirety. And I hope that if you have a constructive comment or a question that you'd like to ask, that you'll certainly feel free to post it. Likewise, if there's anyone out there that would have worked at General Electric's appliance division in the days when this stove was newly manufactured, I would certainly love to hear from you down in the comments with any interesting stories, anecdotes, facts, or whatever you might like to share. Well, here's a little late-breaking correction, amplification, and improvement. It turns out this piece of paper is actually double-sided. So let's flip it over for those of you who might want to read that as well. And again, you can do that by pausing the video if you so desire.